out of chaos, and it was a violent order that they brought to a violent chaos. The story of Egypt is almost exactly opposite of the story of Mesopotamia. Okay? And again, here we see Egypt on our world map. It's the purple part on the world map along the Nile River. Egypt is a river civilization, just like Mesopotamia is. Both of the Middle Eastern civilizations are river civilizations. And here we see Egypt and Mesopotamia. They're close to each other, and they influenced each other a very good deal. When they first started out, they were separate, but there was soon a lot of contact between them. Mesopotamia was slightly earlier than Egypt, but they're pretty much simultaneous. Okay. Egypt was the longest lived, most stable, and wealthiest of the ancient civilizations. It lasted for thousands of years, completely stable. It suffered from very few invasions, and so Egypt was the most, the steadiest of the civilizations. Egypt saw itself as the two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt, and if we look at our map, Upper Egypt, I can't point it out to you, but Upper Egypt is the lower part of the map, okay, because the mountains are to the south. The mountains are to the south, and the Nile flows northward into the Mediterranean Sea, and you can see that delta, which is very large there. That is Lower Egypt. At the top of the map is Lower Egypt. At the bottom of the map is, at the top of the map is Upper Egypt. Wait a minute. Lower Egypt. The bottom of the map is Upper Egypt. Upper Egypt is near the mountains. Lower Egypt is near the sea, where the river flows down to the sea. Okay, the Nile River, just like the Tigris and Euphrates, are the center of Mesopotamian society. The Nile River is the center of Egyptian society. Egypt is very different from Mesopotamia. It has natural barriers on all sides. It's surrounded by desert on east and west. The Mediterranean Sea, at this time there were no seagoing ships, and so there were no invaders coming by sea, so the Mediterranean Sea was a protection to Egypt. And the same is true of the mountains to the south. The mountains acted as protection from barbarian invasions. And so Egypt was protected and suffered from very few invasions. What about the climate of Egypt? Interestingly, Cairo is about the same latitude as Houston, so it's hot. But the climate is very, very good in Egypt because the Nile flows very gently to the sea. The wind blows to the south, and the Nile flows to the north, so that you have two-way transportation up and down the Nile. You can sail upward to Upper Egypt, and because the wind blows in that direction, and you can sail with the current upward to the delta downriver, which would be to the north. The Nile is a very gentle river, where the Tigris and Euphrates are very violent and flood all the time. In violent floods, the Nile River floods very gently, and it floods on a very regular schedule at the same time every year, so you can count on the floods, and the floods fertilize the land, and then they recede very nicely so that you can plant the land. The Nile is a good and friendly river that makes a really good climate for the Egyptians. It's very comfortable, no invasions, no violent weather, no attacks from outside. Just like Mesopotamia, Egypt models its gods on their environment, their climate, and their weather, and their conditions. So what do you think the Egyptian gods are going to be like? Press your mic.
Loving gods that care of other people.
Loving gods taking care of their people, yeah.
Oh, like she said, protection, giving off protection.
Protective gods, caring gods. Do you have a comment? Anybody else? What kind of gods? Loving, kind, benevolent, caretaking gods that love their people and take care of them. That's exactly what their gods are like. That's exactly what their gods are like. Okay. Here is one of my former students went to Egypt. Here you can see the flood in Egypt, the Nile River flooding the land with its very gentle floods. It's really interesting. I wish I had an aerial photograph of Egypt, because you can see the Nile River, and on each side of it is a green strip of land. You can see the green lands that they farm on both sides of the Nile, and of course it's an irrigation culture. They irrigate their land with the Nile, just like in the Tigris-Euphrates River, only the Nile is nicer. And here's the Nile. Here's the Valley of the Kings near Luxor. This is the desert on the edges of the cultivated land of the Nile. They also use that land, and it's part of Egypt as well. But the cultivated land is in green borders on each side of the Nile River Valley. Here is part of the fleet of Queen Hatshepsut. We'll talk about her again. And these are some of the ships that go up and down the Nile. So they're sailing ships that can sail up the Nile and can float with the current down the Nile. Now here are some of these Egyptian ships. Here are some more, the characteristic ships of the Egyptians, and these are 19th century engravings. And here are some more of these ships that ply the Nile, that go up and down the Nile, like beautiful birds sailing up and down the Nile. Here's the irrigation of the Nile. This is 19th century. They're still irrigating in the very ancient way in the 19th century, pumping the water from the Nile to their land. And here is the upper Nile, the rivers, and this is part of the flood again, and the rivers along the Nile. There are three stories of the creation. One of them you had read. I have a shorter version of that. I think I'll read it for you, but let me read you the stories of the creation. There are three. Okay. Here is the one about Atum and the creation of the world. In the beginning there was the primeval abyss, chaos, formlessness. Out of the waters of chaos there gradually emerged a small hillock of wet ground, just as, after the annual flood begins to subside, little mounds of earth come into view above the falling waters. On this primeval mound appeared Atum, the creator. Atum was a male god. Despite this handicap, he produced the first couple, the god Shu and the goddess Tefnut, air and moisture. In a relatively refined version of the story, he accomplished this by spitting. A more pragmatic version makes the hand and phallus of the god the agents of creation. Whatever his method, once the first pair of male and female deities appeared, reproduction proceeded normally thereafter. Shu and Tefnut bore Geb, who was the earth god, male, and Nut, who was the sky goddess, female. And this couple bore Isis and Osiris, Set and Nephthys, and we'll come back to them in a moment. But this is the creation by Atum, the sun god, who created the first couple, brother and sister gods, who then reproduced normally and produced more brother and sister gods. Okay, the brother and sister gods married each other. Okay, this is important to understand. Okay, here is another creation story, Khnum, the potter, who made men out of clay. Okay. Khnum, the potter, made mankind out of clay, and so this is the second creation story. Here is the third, the most provocative of the creation stories, is the one called the Memphite theology. According to this text, the real creator was Ptah, chief god of Memphis. Okay, every city had its own chief god, and this is like Mesopotamia, where every city had its own god. But let me read this to you, and I want to get your reaction to it and see what you think of it. The sight of the eyes, the hearing of the ears, the smelling of air of the nose, they report to the heart. This it is which causes every completed conception to come forth, and it is the tongue which proclaims that which the heart thinks. Indeed, every command of the God came into being through that which the heart thought, and the tongue commanded. What does that say?
That the heart and the mind are one single entity?
The heart and the mind are one. Let me read it to you again, okay? And let's analyze this, what this is exactly saying. The sight of the eyes, the hearing of the ears, the smelling of air of the nose, they report to the heart. Okay, all the senses report their data, what they know, to the heart. The heart is the center of the being. Think of the heart as the mind rather than the heart, okay? The heart, this it is which causes every completed conception to come forth. All right, all the senses report this data, and then the heart or the mind puts it all together and they understand, okay? They understand. And then it is the tongue which proclaims that which the heart thinks. Isn't this a sophisticated thing? And then, indeed, every command of the God came into being through which the heart thought and the tongue commanded. Okay, first there was the thought, and then there was the command. In the beginning was the word it makes you think of. But this is a very sophisticated analysis of the creation. Here we have the creation viewed not as a physical act, but as the result of divine will and divine speech or utterance. For heart read brain or mind. The Egyptians thought of the heart as the seat of the intelligence. This is a very sophisticated creation story. In the global experience number 1, the creation according to Ra, who is another sun god. Okay, they have another sun god named Ra. They have a whole bunch of sun gods, and you wonder why they have so many sun gods, but we'll see why they do in a moment. Creation according to Ra mixes some of these together so that it's kind of like several of these stories put together. And this is what is so interesting about the Egyptian religion. They have over 80 gods and goddesses and probably more. They practice syncretism, which means they never met a god they didn't like. They never get rid of a god. When the cities join each other, when the cities come together and everybody adopts the same religion, they just adopt everybody's religion. I mean, that's why they have, 3 or 4 different sun gods. They just keep all the gods. They never get rid of any gods because they love all of them, because the gods are so good to them. Yeah.
What about,
You want to press your mic?
I'm not sure, was it Tutankhamun that, came up with a new god theory, and they...
No, that's not.
Yeah, they rejected him, so...
Well, that's the one god they rejected, and we'll talk about that in our lecture on the barbarian invasions, because it's the barbarian invasions who caused that change. But we're talking about the very beginning now, and in the very beginning, they kept all their gods. They never got rid of any of their gods. Okay, there are 80 of them. There are 80, and in this, if any of you want to know about any of them, I have this book that lists all of them so that if I can look them up. I can't remember them all. Okay, here is the genealogy of the gods, the main gods. I mentioned Atum, who is the creator god. He's later called Atum Re, a sun god. He was originally a sun god, and Re was a different sun god, so they just joined them both together into one sun god. Sun gods are all the same. And so he is the father god in the creation story I read you, who creates the 2 children, Shu, air, and Tefnut, moisture, and their brother and sister, and they get married. And they have children the regular way, and the children are Geb, earth, and Nut, sky. Geb is the male, and Nut is the female, sky. And so they have 4 children. They have 4 children, Isis, the female, and Osiris, the male, and Set, the male, and Nephthys, the female. Brothers and sisters, and they marry each other. Okay? Then the story gets more complicated. Okay, Isis and Osiris end up brother and sister being married. Once you have 2 brothers, you have Osiris and Set. Then you have rivalry between the 2. And Set actually murders Osiris and chops him up into little pieces and throws them all out all over the whole earth. Isis then goes around and she picks up all the pieces and puts him back together. Okay, and so then Osiris is resurrected and he becomes the god of the dead, and because he represents a vegetation god. In winter everything dies, and then in spring it's all reborn. He represents a vegetation god. And he becomes the god of the dead and the god of the underworld. Isis and Osiris have a son, Horus, and Horus then takes vengeance. Nephthys, actually the sister Nephthys, helps Isis in the resurrection of Osiris. Horus then takes vengeance on Set and kills Set. And then Isis, Osiris, and Horus eventually become the main gods that represent the gods of the people and life after death. But this genealogy of the gods sets a lot of standards for the way things are done in Egypt. They represent parts of nature, air, moisture, earth, and sky, and they represent marriage and the family as well, and also kingship, because the pharaohs, who are the rulers in Egypt, are thought of as descendants of Isis and Osiris and Horus. Okay. Amon is another sun god. He's the chief of the god, one of the many sun gods, and all of these gods are animal-headed gods. Okay, they're human bodies and they have animal heads, and so that they're seen as a part of nature, but they're also immortals of the gods. Here are Isis and Osiris, and they're shown as being pharaohs and ruling as pharaohs. And Isis is on the left, Osiris is on the right. All the pharaohs are said to be descended from Isis and Osiris, and the pharaohs practice sister marriage as well. Brothers and sisters marry. Often people ask, well, were there genetic problems with the marriages of brothers and sisters within the family? And there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence for that, except possibly Akhenaten. And when I show you the pictures of Akhenaten, he looks rather strange and he does strange things. But other than that, they don't seem to have any genetic problems, and they consistently practice this brother and sister marriage. However, we have a lot of different dynasties, so it's not just one dynasty marrying over and over again, but other families come to power. So there are different dynasties that come to power. But the pharaohs are gods, living gods, who are descended from Isis and Osiris, and so here they're shown as the rulers of Egypt on their thrones. This is Horus, who is the son, the avenger of the death of Isis, and he becomes a very important god as well. Okay. This is, again, Isis, Osiris, and Horus. So you can see the three of them there, the main gods of Egypt, on a column at Karnak, and three renditions of Osiris dead and embalmed, and as the eagle-headed god, and as the pharaoh on the left. You can see him. Anubis is another son of Isis and Osiris, and he conducted the souls of the dead from this world to the next and weighed the hearts of the dead before their admission to Osiris's presence. Okay, there is life after death in the Egyptian religion. Okay, what they conceived of was, and here is Osiris weighing the souls, and you can see Anubis, the dog-headed god, they're weighing the souls before they go to Osiris. They weigh their hearts to see if they have done good deeds during their life, and that's how they get to heaven in the afterlife, is if they have done good deeds through their entire life, then they're entitled to the afterlife. And Egyptians were utterly obsessed with the afterlife. You see prayer after prayer, pleas for people to enter the heavens and go to the afterlife. Their conception of the afterlife is extremely interesting. They think of the world as a flat disk, a flat disk, a circle of the disk. And they conceive of the sun going up in the east every morning, crossing across the sky and going down in the west Where does the sun go after it goes down in the west? Why, it goes to the other side of that flat disk, which is flat on the other side. And that other side is exactly like this life, but it's where people go after they die. And it's exactly like life in the Nile River Valley. The Nile runs around on both sides, and the world on the other side of life is exactly like the world on this side of life. What does that tell you about Egyptians, if they have that kind of conception of the afterlife? What does that tell you about them? It tells you something. Think about it. Yeah.
Are you asking like what they knew, like relating to geography?
No, they didn't know anything about geography. I mean, this is what they imagined that the world was like. They imagined that the world is a flat disk. On top of it, people live in the Nile River Valley. When the sun goes around, he goes to the other side, and on the other side is where people go where they die. And it's exactly like the life on this earth on top. So what does that tell you about them? Yeah.
Maybe that they were fairly satisfied with the life that they had.
Good. Yes, exactly. Their life was very happy and very satisfactory, and they wanted it to continue, and they wanted the life in the next world to be just like life in this world. That means life was really, really good for them in the Nile River Valley. It was a happy life. It was a good life. And so they wanted heaven to be just like life in the Nile River Valley. So that tells you how good life was in the Nile Valley. And often they said, the god is satisfied with his offerings. Here's another judgment of the dead, and you can see Anubis and Anubis weighing souls. You can see the jackal-headed god Anubis weighing souls, and over on the left you can see Osiris. The souls are able to go to Osiris after they have been found worthy because they have done good deeds in their life. And by good deeds, it means being kind to people, feeding the poor, helping the less fortunate, being kind to your friends and your enemies as well, and generally being good to people. And so here we have the souls being weighed and going before Osiris. Here's the tomb of one of the young sons of Ramses II, one of the pharaohs. The king introduced the prince, his son, to Anubis. This is a photo by Laura Cullerton. Again, this is taken inside the tomb of Ramses II. And you see Ramses in the middle with his son on the left, and he's holding hands with Anubis. And this shows the partnership between the pharaohs and the gods. The pharaohs and the gods work together. They are one. Yes, question?
What happened to the souls that were found wanting?
They died. They didn't get to go to the happy world.
So there wasn't any conception of a bad afterlife. It was just no afterlife.
No afterlife. The choice is a life just like the happy one they have, or no afterlife. There's something called the Book of the Dead, which is full of prayers for, and they're like charms, and they're prayers. You have some charms in I think it's in the Human Record. There are some charms that they use to recite. They're like magic formulas to try to say the songs or the charms to help the souls go to the afterlife. I mean, they're really obsessed with life after death. It's quite amazing. But there's not a concept of hell or punishment. It's just reward for being good. I mean, it really tells you a lot about this society that they don't punish people. It's pretty interesting. So, but look at Ramses. He's holding hands with Anubis. He's a partner with the gods. And here is a close-up of those hands, the hand of the god and the hand of the pharaoh. They're partners ruling together because, of course, they're related. They're in the same family. The god is satisfied with his offerings. This is what you hear over and over and over again in the prayers to the gods. Again, I said the afterlife, Osiris is the god of the dead. He becomes the god of the people. When the religion first started out, the pharaohs were descended from the gods, and it was thought that the pharaohs were living gods themselves, that they were actually gods who were living on earth. And that's why the pyramids were built. The pyramids are tombs of the gods, and they're built so the pharaohs will go to the afterlife. When the Egyptian religion first started out, it was thought that only the pharaohs went to the afterlife and the life after death. And it was thought, I mean, the pyramids are actually astronomical observatories. I'll show you some pictures of them in a moment, but they're astronomical observatories that are aligned to the stars. And so it was thought that the pharaohs, that there were pathways that actually shot them up to the stars so that they went to the afterlife. But with the legend of Osiris, he becomes the god of the common people. And very early in the history of Egypt, the common people are thought to also have life after death. And it's through Osiris, through the ministrations of Osiris, that everybody can have life after death. So Osiris is the god of the people. Yeah, you press your mic.
Did they have a concept of animals having an afterlife?
No, I don't think they did, although they mummified cats. I'm trying to think. They mummified cats. I'm not sure if they did or not. I've never read anything about animals having an afterlife. That's an interesting question, actually. Actually, I mean, because they thought cats were sacred and they mummified them, which suggests they might have an afterlife. Yeah.
I think there's some cat gods or something.
There are cat. You want to press your mic and say that again? Okay, there are some cat gods. And I might mention that, well, we'll get to the pyramids, and I'll tell you a little more about the pyramids. Narmer is a half-legendary pharaoh who may have been a real person, but he's so legendary we're not sure. But there's a victory of Narmer. He's from Upper Egypt, from the southern part of Egypt, and he actually conquered Lower Egypt, and he unified the Nile River Valley into one land, the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, and the result is balance and harmony. That the two halves of Egypt, the two lands, red land, black land, unify and balance and harmony, and Egypt ever after lives in harmony. It's the pharaoh and the royal family that keep Egypt in harmony. The pharaoh himself is the bringer of ma'at, or harmony to the land, and he's the one who keeps everything in balance and in accord. I'll get to the two lands and the race issue in a moment. I mentioned that they practice sister marriage, and there's actually one pharaoh who's a woman, Hatshepsut, and she's the first woman that we know about in history who exists at all, and she was actually a pharaoh. We'll come to her again in a minute. Okay, I want to talk about the race issue, but let's kind of look at a few different things. Here is the Great Sphinx. The Sphinx was made before the pyramids were made, and he's a supernatural being who has the head of a human and the body of an animal. He was a symbol of the pharaoh, we think, at first, and he was built before the pyramids were built. And here you see the Great Pyramid, and as I said, they were astronomical observatories. Here are some more sphinxes of Amun-Re, and these are at Thebes, and there's a man there. Those are small sphinxes, so you can see a man beside them to get the size of the scale of what they are. Here is the very first pyramid that was built. It's a step pyramid, the oldest surviving building of stone, not long after 3000 BC. This is their first attempt, and it's rather small, and it's kind of a step pyramid. They buried inside, when they first buried the pharaohs inside, they thought they were gods, of course. This is before they thought everybody had life after death. They buried in the pyramid with them servants and animals and jewelry and chairs and furniture and food and everything they thought that the pharaoh needed to take to the afterlife, including people for servants, including animals. So remember I told you in the beginning, every single culture practices human sacrifice. I can't think of one that doesn't practice human sacrifice. The Egyptians did too. Later on, they replaced that and they had a substitute for it. But when they first started out, they buried people and animals and things in the pyramids. Here is another attempt at a pyramid. This one is not so perfect. It doesn't have quite the right shape. The Pyramid of Dashur, about 200 feet long, and they haven't quite got it right. They're still experimenting with it. And here is the period of Sefren when they're getting the shape of it. It's more perfect pyramid. When you see these silly Hollywood movies where they show legions of slaves being whipped to build the pyramid, that is not true. There was no slavery in Egypt at the time of the pyramids. There's no slavery until about 1500 BC when they had barbarian invasions. But in the beginning, there was no slavery. Who built the pyramids then? The pyramids were built by religiously devoted people who were devoted to the pharaohs. They thought the pharaohs maintained the balance and harmony and the happy life in Egypt, and so they willingly built those pharaohs. And so the houses around the pharaohs, the houses of workers, have recently been excavated, and we know from those houses that the people who built the pyramids then did it for religious faith, and they also thought of themselves as sharing in the afterlife through their religious work. Question. Yeah.
There's a study going on that they said that they were paid too, that the workers would pay.
Yes, they were paid. They were paid. They were workers who worked on the pyramid. They did it as their civic duty, but they were also paid, and they did it. They did it for love of the pharaoh. They weren't whipped into it. I mean, they weren't slaves. Now, as far as the engineering goes, and these are monumental buildings. It was 5,000 years, or I think it was 5,000 years before, or 4,000 before buildings as tall as the pyramids were built. Those were the Gothic cathedrals in the Middle Ages. No building that big has been built. We don't know how they built these buildings. We don't know how they moved those giant stones from the quarries. We don't know how they lifted them up to the top. There are lots of guesses. I mean, did they pile sand up? Did they flood around the pyramid? There are guesses. The engineers make a lot of guesses, but we don't know for sure how they really built these pyramids. These are just amazing pyramids. They're gigantic. They're so huge. Here you can see close up the big stones. This is sort of rubble around the outside. They were now they look rough and rough hewn, but they were covered in shining marble at the time of the pharaohs, and so they've been looted over time. So they were very beautiful and huge on the landscape. Here is a drawing of what they must have looked like, and again they're aligned to the stars and they're connected to different monuments there. This is the ancient cemetery of Giza. And again, here is the Great Pyramid with the Sphinx. Okay, attached to them and separate from them too were pyramid temples, and so there were great temples, the 28th century BC, that were gigantic. If you look at the scale of the human being next to those columns, and they're godlike in size, they're godlike in structure. And again, these are places of the dead. They're places of religious ceremony and sacrifice. They're not places where people live. Okay? They're temples to the gods. They're not houses. And we have to look at those with the cities too. Mummification, mummies, and medicine. The Egyptians were very skilled in medicine. They had a great deal of medical knowledge and a great deal of knowledge of how the human body worked, because they practiced embalming, and they were able to preserve the bodies inside of these mummies, and to this day, I mean, they're in very good condition from many, many years ago. There's an absolutely magnificent mummy at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, standing right in the middle as you go upstairs. It's a really magnificent, I think there are two of them actually, two magnificent mummies. So if you get a chance to go to the Museum of Fine Arts, you should go. They have some very fine Egyptian things there, and other things as well, but right now we're doing Egypt. But they have some very fine mummies, and of course they're gilded and they're painted with beautiful artwork. And not only of the pharaohs, the first mummies were the pharaohs trying to preserve their bodies because they wanted to preserve the life of the pharaohs, their rulers, and preserve their state. But then as time went on and common people thought of themselves as living life after death, common people were made mummies, and as we mentioned before, even cats. There were mummies even of cats. I don't know if any other animals there were mummies. I just happen to know there were mummies of cats. Here's the colossal portrait of Ramses II in Nubia. I mentioned the race issue. And of course, as you go to the upper Nile, as you approach sub-Saharan Africa, with the African peoples, the Egyptian were of a race of the Mediterranean world. They did not share in the sub-Saharan African world, but there was a lot of movement of the Egyptians. There was trade with sub-Saharan Africa, and Nubia itself in sub-Saharan Africa shared many of the Egyptian elements of culture. Many of the cultural elements were there, and there was some intermarriage, and you can sort of see this. I mean, I don't know if any genetic studies have been done. This would be interesting to know. I'm going to show you a picture of a pharaoh who looks like, the portrait looks like there's some genes from sub-Saharan Africa. The pharaoh symbolized the community in its temporal and transcendent aspects. And the community of Egypt, the whole state of Egypt, was dependent on the welfare of the pharaoh because it was his harmony, his rule, and his balance that preserved the community and kept it well balanced. Menes was the first historical king, and he was the founder of Memphis and other royal cities. Okay, now here we have a little problem. There were a number of cities in Egypt, but they weren't anything like the cities of Mesopotamia because nobody lived in the cities in Egypt. They were ceremonial cities where ceremonies and religious festivals took place on the behalf of the pharaoh. They were cities of the dead. They were cities of the pharaoh, but they were not a place where people lived. So where did the people of Egypt live? Well, they lived along the edges of the Nile. They didn't live on the farmland. They lived on the edge of the desert along the Nile. And it's an agricultural populace that lives in the agricultural land. They didn't live in cities. And so so can you call them a civilization if they didn't live in cities? I think there's no doubt that Egypt is a civilization. But people did not live in cities. So this is very interesting. The cities, we're going to see some of these magnificent cities, but they were cities of ceremony and ritual. The pharaoh himself was the fount that should be, we've got a spell check at work here, it should be the fount of law, and he governed by decrees. The pharaoh himself represented Ma'at, or justice, truth, and rightness, and when the pharaoh ruled with his Ma'at, with justice and truth and rightness, the whole world was in harmony. Okay. Now, in Mesopotamia, you have law codes. There are no law codes in Egypt because people didn't have to have their rights guaranteed. I mean, the pharaoh just protected them and took care of them. And you don't have a lot of crime, and you don't have a lot of, laws were not necessary. And think about that. Why were laws not necessary? I'm going to give you a reason in a moment why laws were not necessary, but there were no law codes. That's very interesting that there were no law codes. Okay, here is the pharaoh, and here you see the pharaoh with a headdress that represented his animal-headed self. This is King Khafra, builder of the second pyramid of Giza. And on the right is the head of a royal statue of bronze. We're not sure exactly who that is. Here is Amenophis, Rahotep, and he has characteristics of Upper Egypt, of sub-Saharan Africa, and so we think there was some intermarriage. There definitely would have been, but the culture of the Mediterranean was more dominant. But there was intermarriage between Upper and Lower Egypt. And here is the Pharaoh. What do you notice about some of these statues? I mean, use your eyes. Remember that artifacts like statues and art and buildings, architecture, this is historical evidence, historical truth as well. What do you see in these statues? How would you describe this statue? Yeah.
Most of the statues of the pharaohs are displayed as perfect, and they don't age, at least in the earlier periods.
Well, maybe in the earlier, what about this statue? I mean, take a look at this statue. What do you think about it?
Well, as far as this one, it's not, I guess, romanticized. He doesn't look perfect. He looks like he's got a little bit pudge on him, and he's got some saggy man. Exactly.
This is realistic art, isn't it? It's realistic. All the Mesopotamian art we looked at was very stylized and very symbolic. And this art is realistic. Did you have a comment?
And also, he or she is sitting, and a lot of the statues display the gods as sitting on chairs or like thrones.
Yes.
Does that constitute comfort?
No, it constitutes their ruling power as Pharaoh. I mean, but the throne of the Pharaoh was his seat, from which he ruled the whole kingdom, and so it symbolizes his power and authority, and his godliness, seated on a throne like that. The headdress is particularly symbolic of his ruling power and his affinity with the gods. We're going to see some other symbols of the ruling power and affinity with the gods, but I think we need to recognize how lifelike this Egyptian art is. It's extremely lifelike and realistic, as opposed to what we saw in Mesopotamia that was much more stylized. Okay, hieroglyphics are the characteristic writing of Egypt. There was a profound influence of Mesopotamia on the first dynasty, and we know there was trade between Egypt and Mesopotamia. It's probably due more to the Mesopotamians, who were great traders and adventurers and traveled all around, but they brought into Egypt the concept of building, of gigantic buildings. And you notice how like the ziggurats, the pyramids are. The pyramid is the typical building of Egypt, and the ziggurat is the typical building of Mesopotamia. Whereas in Mesopotamia, the ziggurat is the center of the city and the home of the god. Here in Egypt, the pyramid is the tomb of the god, and so it has an entirely different function, but the shape and the idea are somewhat similar. And so they learned this from Mesopotamia because Mesopotamia was earlier. They also got the idea of writing from Mesopotamia, but their writing is entirely different. Instead of cuneiform, the cuneiform of Mesopotamia, they have hieroglyphics, okay? And here is a very early example of hieroglyphics. This is a date by the name of the year. And actually, writing started because, remember we talked about the Nile that flooded very regularly? Well, the first written records were records of the Nile's flooding. They kept a calendar and they kept track of the date so that they could predict when the Nile would flood. And so this was the very earliest writing in Egypt. Yeah.
How did they keep track of the dates? Did they have, like, as far as the calendar? I don't think they kept the same date, the same chart of dates as we would nowadays. So.
No, they invented their own calendar. I mean, if you observe the seasons, you know that it gets cold in winter and the days are shorter, and it's hot in summer, and so you can divide the year into months. I'm going to give you their calendar. It's a little later in the lecture, but they had a calendar. It was an agricultural calendar, but mostly based on the flooding of the Nile and the growing of crops. So they invented a calendar, and they invented dates and to keep track of the flooding of the Nile. So it's the flooding of the Nile that sort of spurred on this inventiveness of trying to do this record keeping that they had. And this spurred on the writing, the invention of writing. This is Egyptian writing. It's called hieroglyphics. It's picture writing. It's utterly different from the cuneiform that we saw in Mesopotamia. They made actual pictures, and you can recognize pictures for the words there. You have a scarab, you see an eagle. What else do you see? A man? What do you see in there that you know would be a word? An eye? Okay. So that you can, yeah.
Maybe the squiggly lines of mountain.
Could be, yes. I'm sorry I don't know all of these, but actually you can buy dictionaries that tell all of these, tell what all these symbols are, and people can learn Egyptian. But these are hieroglyphics, and here are the hieroglyphics. They were actually translated. It used to be that nobody could read them. Nobody could read the hieroglyphics. They were utterly lost to modern people until the time of Napoleon. And Napoleon, in his great quest to conquer the world, conquered Egypt. And when he got there to Egypt, he discovered the magic key to deciphering Egyptian hieroglyphics. And this is the Rosetta Stone. Here is one version of it. I'm going to show you another version next lecture of what this looks like. But the Rosetta Stone had on it, at the top, it had Egyptian hieroglyphics. In the middle, it had an Egyptian script that was kind of a written script, and at the bottom it had Greek, and they were all the same inscription. But nobody knew that. Nobody knew that. There was this huge intellectual race in England and France to be the first to use the Rosetta Stone to translate the Egyptian hieroglyphics. And here you see the hieroglyphics translated into syllables. The middle script was syllabic in syllables. And here you see the pictographic writing and the syllables that they represent. Here's Napoleon at the tomb of the pharaohs and discovering the Rosetta Stone. And here is Champollion, who was the Frenchman who actually succeeded in the great race to be the first to decipher the hieroglyphic language. And here he did it with these seals. These are actually seals of from the Greek times of Ptolemy and Cleopatra. After Alexander the Great conquered Egypt and there were Greeks ruling Egypt, Cleopatra was one of them, and her husband was Ptolemy, and he did it by comparing the hieroglyphics in these ovals with the name of Ptolemy and the name of Cleopatra, and he could match up the letters in both names and figure out what the letters were, and that's how he deciphered. He began the decipherment of the hieroglyphic language. Did you have a question?
Did the church try to have a conflict? Because I know there was something the church didn't want to translate, the hieroglyphics or something.
I'm not aware of it, but this is the age of the Enlightenment, and Napoleon utterly ignored the church. He had nothing to do with the church. I mean, he actually was anti-church, and so he would not have cared if the church didn't want it. But I mean, it was a very intellectual, it was the age of the Enlightenment where the church was ignored and people depended on human reason. So they were very eager to interpret this language. So here they're working on it. Here's an Egyptian song they start interpreting. I love this song. Okay, here's a translation of that song. And see, you can almost read it when you look at it. Thresh for yourselves, and then there's a repeat sign up there. You can see that little circle and 2 slashes means repeat. Thresh for yourselves, O oxen. Thresh for yourselves, thresh for yourselves. Measures for yourselves, measures for your masters. Isn't that a neat little Egyptian song that you can read with the hieroglyphics? And there were millions of hieroglyphics. Remember, in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, there were millions of bricks with sort of records of trading transactions on the merchant records, but in Egypt there were public hieroglyphics, largely to do with the pharaohs and with the government and the public state of Egypt. And so there was a great race to translate all of these wonderful hieroglyphics everywhere in Egypt. This is the gateway of Karnak, again, one of those ceremonial cities. Here is the facade of an Egyptian temple, again, covered with hieroglyphics. There were thousands of them, and so people just... And here you can see on the left a close-up of the wall that you see on the right with thousands and thousands of these characters to be translated, and so the scholars just went crazy about them. Here is a column. Again, everything had hieroglyphics. There were inscriptions on everything that told everything. I mentioned before there were ceremonial cities. The cities of Memphis, Thebes, and Karnak were cities of the pharaohs. Nobody lived there. They were reserved for religious rituals. People lived in the countryside along the Nile River. The pharaoh had around him a court, though. He had a royal administration, and he had a bureaucracy. He had servants who were at court who governed the country. And the country of Egypt was a unified country almost from the very beginning, and it remained unified. It was the direct opposite of Mesopotamia. You only had that one conquest where Upper Egypt conquered Lower Egypt, and then it remained unified, and you don't have civil wars going on all the time. The royal administration was run by scribes and the scribal class, and there was complete social mobility. You could be a peasant born in a farming hut on the edge of the Nile desert and the Nile farmlands, and you could, if you went to school and you became educated and became a scribe, you could grow up to be the wazir. You could be the prime minister of Egypt, and many of these people did. You could rise from the lowest ranks to the highest ranks. There was no permanent capital until 1500 BC, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. I'll tell you more about Egyptian life and how we know about that. There are records of people who rise from the dust to become part of the government. Here's the great temple of Karnak in the Nile Valley at Thebes. Okay, an aerial view, and again these ceremonial cities. Here is a map of that city of Thebes on the west side and the islands in the Nile, and I'm going to tell you more about these islands in the Nile that are very interesting and what they do as we look at some other records. Here are gigantic portrait statues of Amenhotep III at Thebes, again the ceremonial cities, 70 feet high. And here is the temple at Karnak, again this huge temple, godlike in form and in size. This is again the temple in Karnak. The ceremonial cities, another temple of Abydos. I can't read that again. You can see the people there for the size. Okay, this is the structure of the Egyptian government. At the top is the pharaoh. This is the royal administration. The pharaoh is the ruler of the land. He's both the ceremonial and the actual ruler of the land. He keeps the balance and harmony. He has under him a grand vizier who is the prime minister who actually runs the government, takes care of the running of the government, and under him there are offices of state. I guess you could call them sort of like in our government we have the Department of State and the Department of the Treasury, the Department of what else? Department of Justice. Okay, here you have a Chief Justice who is the head of the Department of Justice. You have the Treasurer of the God who is in charge of the Treasury and the tax collecting. You have the Chief of the Fields who is in charge of agriculture. You have the Master of the King's Largesse who is in charge of trade. Okay, and so you have all of these chief offices of state, And under them, there are bureaucracies of scribes who take care of the duties of office. It is a unified state, not based on cities, but it's a government that unifies the entire country. But the country is divided into nomes, into districts, and each of these nomes is ruled by nomarchs. It's like the United States is divided into states. Well, Egypt is divided into nomes, and each nome is ruled by a nomarch. Nomarchs call themselves leader of the Lord, chief of fortifications, ruler of the king's people, chief of commands. They think of themselves as a pharaoh in miniature taking care of their local district. Okay, and there are times of great trouble when there are invasions that come. Now I can't find it. There are invasions that come from the barbarian invasions, and the barbarians invade, and the pharaohs fall out of office. There are times of interregnum where there are no pharaohs on the throne, and when that happens, Egypt does not fall apart. It remains unified, and the nomes take care of their nomarchs. The nomarchs take care of their nomes and make sure that everything is taken care of in the state. Okay. Here are some statements by some of these nomarchs during the first intermediate period. This is a statement made by an Upper Egyptian nomarch who had taken matters in his own hands in the first intermediate period when there was no pharaoh on the throne because there was a barbarian invasion. This is what the nomarch says. I was one who computed carefully the consumption of Lower Egyptian grain. I made a canal for this town when Upper Egypt was in a bad way and one did not see any water. I made high fields into marsh. I made the Nile inundate wasteland. That means he watered the land, he irrigated it. Whoever needed water got Nile water as he desired. I had a lot of Lower Egyptian grain, which is barley, when the country was in tribulation. I was the one who fed the town with measures and bushels of grain during a period of starvation. I made the small man and his wife carry away Lower Egyptian grain. That means he gave it to the poor, he gave the grain to the poor, and likewise he gave grain to the widow and her son. I had all the taxes reduced, which I found registered as arrears from the time of my father. So he's bragging about taking care of the people in the same way that the Pharaoh would take care of the people. He saw himself as a kind of Pharaoh in miniature. Here's another monarch, a nomarch, who is writing at Crocodilopolis in Upper Egypt. Crocodilopolis is one of those islands in the Nile that I showed you in the map of Thebes. And here's what he is saying. I fed the island in the river, Crocodilopolis, during years of drought when 400 men were in poverty there. I did not take away a man's daughter nor his field because he was in debt. I acquired 10 flocks of goats with people to take care of them, 2 herds of cattle, and 1 of asses. I bred small livestock. I obtained 30 boats of one kind and 30 of another. I brought Upper Egyptian grain to Hermonthis and Asphinus after Crocodilopolis was taken care of. He gave grain to other islands who were starving at the time when they were in need. The nome of Thebes came upstream to obtain grain from me, but Crocodilopolis never sent downstream nor upstream for grain to another nome. Okay, so he's bragging about how he took such good care of his people, just as a pharaoh would have if a pharaoh had been on the throne. Question? Yeah.
When these invasions are happening, does the art become more stylized when they're representing their leaders?
That's kind of interesting. You know, most of the art is naturalistic, but there are periods of when it's more naturalistic than others. It doesn't become more stylized in the invasions. But the invasions, I'll give you dates at the end of the lecture. I have some dates of the invasions. They don't last very long, actually. They're only about 100 years for each invasion. Here's education. Scribes in schools meant social mobility. I mentioned social mobility. You have one of your readings in the Global Experience, number 13, a school book. It is so interesting. It really is a very interesting book, interesting reading. I won't have time to read it all to you, but it's... let me read you some of the titles of them. The Praise of the Scribe's Profession, and he talks about the scribe and the royal overseer of the cattle of Amun-Re, king of the gods. A noble profession. You will find it useful. You will be advanced by your superiors. You will be sent on a mission. Love writing, shun dancing, and then you become a worthy official. So the life of a scribe is very, very good. And here's some advice to the unwilling pupil. Young fellow, how conceited are you? You do not listen when I speak. Your heart is denser than a great obelisk, 100 cubits high, 10 cubits thick. And it's going. And so he talks about, but though I beat you with every kind of stick, you do not listen. If I knew another way of doing it, I would do it for you that you might listen. So he's trying to teach the student to be a scribe so he can have a good life. The idle scribe is worthless, and so a scribe who doesn't do his work is not good. All occupations are bad except that of the scribe. And this is a very, very interesting reading. It's on page 49. It describes all the occupations of Egypt. It's extremely interesting. The washerman's day is going up, going down. All his limbs are weak from whitening his neighbor's clothes every day, from washing their linen. The maker of pots is smeared with soil. The cobbler mingles with vats. The watchman prepares garlands and polishes vase stands. And the merchant, he talks about the merchants and the ship's crews and the carpenters. And so you can get a picture of all the occupations of Egypt. But the scribe, he alone records the output of all of them. Take note of it. All of those people have to work and work hard, but the scribe sits there and just takes notes on what they're doing. And so this, then he goes on, the misfortunes of the peasant. The scribe does not suffer like the soldier. The pupil wishes to build a mansion for his teacher, so that the scribe is very grateful to his teacher and wants to build him a mansion. I wish all students were like that. Anyway, so the glories of the scribal life are in that reading. It's a very nice reading. Scribes mean social mobility. You can be from the poorest family of Egypt, and you can rise to the top to be Grand Vizier. And how do we know this? Because I actually have a reading of a man who rose from the very bottom of society to the top of society. I'm going to read it to you in a minute, but let's look at a little more things here. So education and scribes and schools meant social mobility. Here are some of the occupations of the Egyptians. The collection of taxes by the local treasury officials. Okay, so this would be the Department of the Treasury collecting the taxes. Here is plowing and sowing, the agriculture, the farmer, the life of the farmer. Here is a village near the pyramids where everybody lived on the edge of the Nile. They didn't live on the cultivated land or in the cities. Here is a house, an Egyptian dwelling of what people would live in, and the roof is flat. They would go up to the roof to be cool and sleep at night. Here is a village chieftain who might have been like a nomarch. I'm just guessing he's like a nomarch. Here is a Nile farm with the fields that are cultivated where people would live. Peasants were not oppressed. Peasants and serfdom meant security. They were attached to the land. They had a job. They could have food from their land. They were not like slaves or serfs, but they were treated well in the land. They had protection and they had the right of appeal, ma'at. Remember, there was justice in the land. There were no castes. There was complete social mobility. Probably no slavery before 1500 BC. So we're talking maybe 1500 years with no slavery. Slavery comes with the barbarian invasions, and I'll tell you about that later, how that comes. This is the wisdom of Ptah-hotep, and I wanted to read a little bit to you about this. I'll try to do it quickly because we're almost out of time, but these are one of the wisdom books. There are a whole bunch of these wisdom books. This is what we have instead of law codes. And listen to what these wisdom books say. This is written by Ptah-hotep. It's written for his son. And its instructions, the ignorant about wisdom and the rules for good speech, the advantage to him who will hearken, and the disadvantage to him who may neglect them. And he says this to his son. Let not thy heart be puffed up because of your knowledge. Be not confident because you are a wise man. Take counsel with the ignorant as well as the wise. If you are a leader commanding the affairs of the multitude, seek out every beneficial deed until it may be that your own affairs are without wrong. Justice is great and its appropriateness is lasting. If you are one of those sitting at the table of a man greater than yourself, take what he may give when it is set before you, that you should gaze at what is before you. Do not pierce him with many stares, for such an aggression against him is an abomination. Let your face be cast down until he addresses you, and you should speak only when he talks to you, and laugh at his jokes. Okay. How to get ahead in the world. Don't seduce his wife, it also says. If you are a man of intimacy, one whom one great man sends to another, be reliable when he sends you. Grasp hold of truth and do not exceed it. If you are a man of standing and you found a household and produce a son who is pleasing to God, if he is correct and inclines toward your ways and listens to your instructions, take care of him. You should not cut him off from you. But if your son rebels, and here is evidence of rebellious teenagers, if your son creates enmity and goes astray and transgresses your plans and does not carry out your instructions, send him away and get rid of him. But give him 2 chances first. And then if he still remains stubborn, then you send him away. If you are one to whom petition is made, be calm as you listen to the petitioner's speech. Do not rebuff him before he has swept out his body or before he has said that for which he came. A petitioner likes attention to his words better than the fulfilling of that for which he came. This is full of wise advice of how to deal with people. If you desire to make friendship last in a home to which you have access as master or brother or friend, into any place where you might enter, beware of approaching the women. Here's where it says, don't seduce your boss's wife. Don't be greedy. Don't be greedy. If you are a man of standing, you should found your household and love your wife at home as is fitting. Fill her belly, clothe her back. Ointment is a prescription for her body. Make her heart glad as long as you live. She is a profitable field for her Lord. You should not contend with her at law and keep her far from gaining control. Don't let your wife take over. But make her happy, but give her everything that makes her happy. Okay? If you are a man of standing, sitting in the councils of his Lord, summon your resources for good. If you are silent, it is better than teflet plants. If you speak, you should know how you can explain difficulties. It is a real craftsman who can speak in council. If you are now important after your former unimportance, and here it shows where he's climbed to the top from nothing. If you are now important after your former unimportance, so that you may do things after a neediness formerly in the town, which you know, in contrast to what was your lot before, do not be miserly with your wealth, which has accrued to you as a gift of the God. You are not behind some other equal of yours to whom the same has happened. Bow your back to your superior, your overseer from the palace. Then your household will be established in its property, and your recompense will be as it should be. Opposition to a superior is a painful thing, for one lives as long as he is mild. Okay, this is how to get ahead in the world, how to be successful. And this is what we have instead of law books. We have social advice as how to behave in society, how to get ahead in the world. And what I read to you was the wisdom of Ptahhotep. And there are a lot of wisdom books like that that tell you how to behave in social situations. That's what we have instead of law codes. There are 3 seasons in Egypt, and I told you I would tell you the 3 seasons. There is inundation or flooding from mid-July to mid-November. There is coming forth when the crops come up in the fields in mid-November to mid-March. And there is drought from mid-March to mid-July. So you have 3 seasons in the year, and they are utterly predictable. I'm giving modern months here, but these are the Egyptian months. Okay, and here's inundation with the flood coming around the pyramids of Giza. Utterly predictable. Records were kept of the flooding of the Nile from the first dynasty, that's 3000 BC, and so they create a calendar. This encouraged the use of writing and record keeping and bureaucracy. And the bureaucracies and the flowering of the culture meant the growth of crafts and industry and internal trade in Egypt. And here you see Egyptians plowing in the fields. Here they are in a noble's tomb. You see the noble's servants plowing his fields and taking care of his animals. And this is the noble. The large one is the noble. Okay, it's shown larger than anybody else. Here are peasants milking in the Pyramid Age, so they practice the cattle, the raising of cattle. And here is a donkey carrying a load of grain sheaves in the Pyramid Age. These are all taken from hieroglyphics. Here are cabinet makers, and you can see all the tools of the cabinet makers' trade as they're making furniture and other needs of the society. Here is a potter's wheel and furnaces for making pottery. So you have the manufacture of goods for use and for trade. Goldsmith's workshop, luxury goods, and you can see all of the different processes in the taking care of gold. They don't have hard metals yet. They only have these soft metals. Here is the villa of an Egyptian noble who could live in quite some comfort. It's much bigger than the peasants' huts we've shown before. Egyptian women, as you saw from the reading from the Wisdom of Ptahhotep, wives and women were treated very well. They were regarded as having a lot of rights, and recent research has shown that Egyptian women had a lot of rights within their society. We can identify several Egyptian women who were powerful. Queen T, who was the mother of Akhenaten, the Pharaoh Akhenaten. Hatshepsut was the first known woman in history. And she herself was a pharaoh. When her father died and she had no brothers, she actually became a pharaoh. She wore the pharaoh's crown. She sat on the pharaoh's throne. And she even wore a little fake beard, which was the symbol of the pharaoh's rule, a little kind of square beard on her chin that represented her authority. Nefertiti, Akhenaten's queen, is an important woman in history. Women enjoyed equality, freedom, and security. And you have a reading in the Global Experience on Hatshepsut and the power that she had during her reign. And here are Hatshepsut's obelisks that she put up. There are a number of pharaohs who put up these obelisks with hieroglyphics that tell about her name. She was actually married to one of the chief generals who helped her in her rule, but she's the first woman in history that we know about. And here's a drawing of ships transporting Queen Hatshepsut's 350-ton obelisk down the Nile River in the 15th century BC. And I showed you her ships at the beginning of the hour. all of this lasted until the time of the barbarian invasions. There was no slavery. There was internal prosperity and peace in Egypt until the barbarian invasions. And there were two major interregnums. From the 6th to the 12th dynasty, from 2150 to 2080, somewhat less than 100 years BC, there was an interregnum where there were no pharaohs on the throne. This is when barbarians invaded. This lasted a very short time. The more important one was 1640 to 1570 BC, when there was a major barbarian invasion, and it utterly changed the country. During the time of these invasions and no pharaohs on the throne, the nomarchs were in control. The country held together because the nomarchs took over. But they caused enormous changes in Egypt. There were changes in the perception of the pharaoh. We see the introduction of imperialism in Egypt that hadn't been there before. And we see the growth of trade with people outside of Egypt that hadn't been there before. And this is what we'll take up next week. Next week, we're going to look at these barbarians and who they were and what they did to Egypt and Mesopotamia and how they utterly changed history. One of these barbarians, there are two groups of barbarians we're going to look at. We're going to look at the Indo-Europeans who come into this area, and we're going to look at the Hebrews. Both of them were barbarians who invaded the original Mesopotamian and Egyptian world. So go on the website, because I have some readings for you, especially about the Hebrews, that you need to read for next week. And be sure and do your readings before you come to class, because we'll discuss them in class. Okay? Okay, see you all next week.